The sound of whispers cut through the humid air of Fort Meridian like daggers of suspicion. Sharp, calculating, and merciless. A middle-aged woman stood quietly at the recruitment processing center, her weathered duffel bag resting beside her worn boots, while a group of fresh-faced recruits exchanged knowing glances behind her back. They had been watching her for the past hour, convinced they had spotted something the officers had missed: a fraud, a pretender, someone who didn't belong among the steel and honor of the nation's most prestigious military installation. But what these eager young soldiers didn't realize was that the moment they decided to expose her deception, they were about to discover that some legends walk among us in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to remind us what true greatness looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete courtyard of Fort Meridian Central Command, casting long shadows across the pristine grounds where generations of soldiers had taken their first steps toward military service. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant echo of drill sergeants barking commands at new recruits. It was here, in this place of beginnings and transformations, that recruit Thompson first noticed the woman who would change everything he thought he knew about respect and authority. She sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the processing station, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her clothes were simple faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and scuffed leather boots that had clearly seen better days. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face bore the kind of quiet lines that spoke of years spent squinting against harsh sunlight and harder decisions. To most observers, she looked like any other military spouse or family member waiting for paperwork to be processed. Perhaps a mother dropping off a son or daughter for basic training. But something about her had caught the attention of Thompson and his fellow recruits Jackson, Rivera, and Walsh, who had been loitering near the vending machines, trying to look busy while avoiding their next assignment. It started when Jackson noticed her filling out what appeared to be officer documentation, her pen moving with the kind of confident strokes that suggested familiarity with military paperwork. Then Rivera spotted her duffel bag, which bore no visible unit patches or identifying marks, yet seemed to contain items that clinked softly like metal whenever she shifted it. "Look at her," Thompson whispered to his companions, nodding toward the woman. "She's filling out officer forms. You see any rank on those clothes? Any military ID visible?" Jackson squinted in her direction, his young face already twisted with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from 6 weeks of basic training and a burning desire to prove his military knowledge. "Probably some military spouse trying to get base privileges she's not entitled to," he muttered. "I've heard about people like that, civilians who think they can waltz onto base and claim benefits." Walsh, barely 19 and still sporting the pale tan lines from recently removed thick-rimmed glasses, nodded eagerly. "My drill sergeant warned us about this exact thing. People trying to impersonate military personnel for benefits, respect, whatever. It's stolen valor, and it's disgusting." Rivera, who prided himself on being the most observant of the group, had been studying the woman's bag with growing suspicion. "That duffel bag looks military issue, but it's not standard current gear. And look how she's sitting too comfortable, like she owns the place. Real military personnel show more, I don't know, awareness of their surroundings." The 4 recruits had worked themselves into a state of moral outrage, convinced they had identified a serious security breach that the busy processing officers had somehow overlooked. In their minds, they were about to perform a service to their beloved military by exposing a fraud who dared to sully the sacred grounds of Fort Meridian with her deception. Thompson, who had appointed himself the unofficial leader of their little group, made the decision that would haunt him for years to come. "We need to do something about this," he declared, his voice carrying the false confidence of youth and inexperience. If the officers are too busy to notice, then it's our duty as future soldiers to protect the integrity of this institution. The woman seemed oblivious to their scrutiny, continuing to fill out her paperwork with methodical precision. Occasionally, she would glance up at the flag fluttering in the distance, her expression unreadable but somehow distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the immediate present. There was a stillness about her that the recruits mistook for nervousness, a quiet patience they interpreted as the behavior of someone trying not to draw attention to herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they approached her bench, their boots clicking against the concrete with what they imagined was intimidating authority, none of them noticed the subtle straightening of her shoulders or the way her eyes briefly assessed each of them, with the kind of quick, professional evaluation that becomes second nature after decades of command. They were too focused on their mission, too intoxicated by their own sense of righteousness to recognize that they were about to challenge someone whose very presence in this place was about to teach them the most important lesson of their young military careers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform 4 cocky recruits into humble soldiers and reveal that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who no longer need to prove their worth to anyone. The woman they had been watching was Commander Evelyn Cross. Though none of the recruits knew her name or understood the weight it carried throughout the Pacific Fleet, to Thompson and his companions, she appeared to be nothing more than a middle-aged civilian who had somehow managed to slip past base security, a woman whose very presence seemed to mock the rigid standards they had been taught to uphold during their brief time in the military. At 52, Evelyn had the kind of understated presence that came from years of commanding respect through competence rather than volume. Her hands, weathered from salt air and countless hours gripping ship wheels in rough seas, rested calmly on her knees as she reviewed the memorial service paperwork. The lines around her eyes spoke of decades spent scanning horizons for threats and opportunities, while the slight stoop in her shoulders suggested the weight of decisions that had affected thousands of lives. Her clothing choices that day had been deliberate civilian clothes for a personal mission, not an official one. The faded jeans had been a Christmas gift from her late husband, and the white cotton t-shirt was soft from years of washing. Her leather boots, though scuffed and worn, were comfortable enough for the long day she had planned. She had deliberately left her uniform at home, wanting to blend in, to complete her task without the ceremony and attention that her rank would inevitably attract. To Rivera, who considered himself particularly observant, she looked like every military spouse he had encountered during family days, tired, slightly overwhelmed by military bureaucracy, and probably struggling to understand the complex web of regulations that govern base life. "Look at how she's holding that pen," he whispered to Walsh. "She keeps pausing like she doesn't understand the forms, probably trying to figure out what lies to tell." Jackson had formed his own theory based on her posture and demeanor. "See how she keeps looking around? That's classic nervous behavior. She's checking to make sure no one notices her filling out paperwork she has no right to be touching. My uncle's a cop," he taught. "A me to spot liars by their body language." Thompson studied her with the intensity of someone who had watched too many military procedural shows and considered himself an expert on proper military bearing. "Real service members carry themselves differently," he announced with the confidence of his 6 weeks of training. "They're more alert, more aware of their surroundings. She's just sitting there like she's waiting for a bus." Walsh, the youngest of the group, had focused on what he perceived as her obvious attempts at deception. "And those boots, military style but clearly purchased at some surplus store. Real military personnel don't wear gear that looks like costume pieces." She's probably one of those people who shops at Army-Navy stores to look the part. What none of them could see was the way Evelyn's eyes automatically tracked movement patterns around the courtyard, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had spent decades responsible for the safety of others. They missed how her seemingly relaxed posture was actually a textbook example of alert readiness, muscles loose but prepared for instant action. They couldn't recognize the significance of how she held the pen, not with the hesitation of confusion, but with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every word on official military documents carried weight and consequence. Her pauses weren't signs of deception, but moments of careful consideration. The habit of an officer who had learned that hastily completed paperwork could mean the difference between life and death for the people under her command. The irony was that everything about Evelyn cross-screamed military leadership, to anyone with the experience to recognize it. The way she unconsciously straightened when a drill sergeant's voice carried across the courtyard. How her eyes briefly followed the precision movements of a passing honor guard with the appreciation of someone who understood the discipline required to achieve such synchronization. The subtle nod of acknowledgement she gave to a passing senior enlisted man, who instinctively straightened his own posture in response to something he couldn't quite identify but recognize nonetheless. But to 4 young recruits drunk on their own limited knowledge and burning with righteous indignation, she was nothing more than a fraud waiting to be exposed. They saw civilian clothes and assumed civilian status. They witnessed quiet confidence and mistook it for nervous deception. They observed careful deliberation and interpreted it as criminal hesitation. As they prepared to confront what they believed was a clear case of stolen valor. None of them realized they were about to challenge someone whose naval service record was studied in military academies, whose tactical decisions had saved thousands of lives, and whose name was spoken with reverence in Pentagon briefing rooms. Evelyn Cross continued her paperwork, unaware that her peaceful afternoon was about to become a teaching moment that 4 young soldiers would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Thompson took the lead as the 4 recruits approached the bench. His chest puffed out with the kind of manufactured confidence that comes from believing you're about to perform a heroic act. The afternoon heat had intensified, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he rehearsed in his mind the speech he had been crafting for the past 10 minutes. In his imagination, this confrontation would unfold like a scene from a military thriller. He would expose the fraud. Other soldiers would gather to witness his vigilance, and perhaps even an officer would commend him for his sharp eye and dedication to military integrity. "Ma'am," Thompson said. His voice artificially deepened in an attempt to project authority he didn't possess. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Evelyn looked up from her paperwork, her gray eyes meeting his with the kind of calm attention that made Thompson suddenly wish he had thought this through more carefully. There was something in her gaze, not fear, not guilt, not even surprise, but a patient curiosity, as if she were watching an interesting experiment unfold. "Excuse me?" she replied, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent years diffusing tense situations with nothing more than controlled communication. Jackson stepped forward, emboldened by what he interpreted as her attempt to play innocent. "We've been watching you, and we know what you're doing," he declared, pointing an accusatory finger at the papers in her lap. "You're filling out military documentation without proper authorization. That's fraud, and we're not going to let you get away with it." Rivera joined the verbal assault, his voice rising with excitement. "Yeah, and that bag of yours looks like military issue. But you're not wearing any rank, any identification, nothing that proves you have the right to be here. You think you can just waltz onto a military installation and pretend to be someone you're not?" Walsh, not wanting to be left out of what he was certain would become a legendary story among their recruit class, added his own accusation. "We know stolen valor when we see it." My drill sergeant warned us about people like you civilians, who think they can claim military benefits and respect they never earned. It's disgusting, and you should be ashamed of yourself." The four young men had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around the bench, their body language aggressive and confrontational. Other people in the area, genuine military family members, off-duty personnel, and visiting civilians, began to notice the commotion. Some stopped to watch, curious about what was unfolding, while others gave the group a wide berth. Sensing the tension in the air, Thompson felt a rush of vindication as he noticed the growing audience. This was exactly what he had hoped for: witnesses to his dedication to military values, people who would see him standing up for what was right. "We're giving you one chance to come clean," he continued, his voice growing louder. "Admit what you're doing, pack up your fake military gear, and leave this base with whatever dignity you have left." Evelyn's expression remained unchanged, though a careful observer might have noticed the slightest tightening around her eyes, not from fear or anger, but from a kind of weary familiarity with young soldiers who confused volume with authority and aggression with leadership. She had dealt with countless hot-headed junior officers over the years, men and women who thought they could intimidate their way to respect, and she recognized the type immediately. "I see," she said simply, folding her hands over the paperwork and looking at each of the four recruits in turn. Her calm response only seemed to inflame their righteous anger further. Jackson's face was beginning to flush red. Whether from the heat, embarrassment, or fury, it was impossible to tell. "Don't give us that innocent act," he snarled. "We're not stupid. We can see through your little charade. You probably bought that bag at some surplus store. Maybe even stole it from a real service member." Rivera had become increasingly animated, pacing back and forth in front of the bench like a prosecutor presenting his case to a jury. "And look at how you're sitting, no military bearing whatsoever. Real service members don't slouch around on benches filling out paperwork they have no business touching. You're probably not even supposed to be on this base." The verbal assault continued for several more minutes, each recruit trying to outdo the others in their expressions of moral outrage. They accused her of dishonoring the uniform, of spitting in the faces of real veterans, of taking advantage of benefits meant for those who had actually served their country. Their voices grew louder, their gestures more dramatic, and their accusations more severe with each passing moment. Walsh, perhaps feeling that the confrontation wasn't escalating quickly enough, made the decision to take things to the next level. "You know what? I think we need to search that bag of yours. I bet we'll find all kinds of fake military gear in there, probably stuff you bought online or stole from actual service members." A small crowd had gathered by this point, drawn by the shouting and aggressive postures of the four recruits. Some watched with uncomfortable expressions, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation, but uncertain whether they should intervene. Others seemed to be waiting to see how the drama would unfold, treating it like entertainment rather than a serious confrontation. Throughout the entire verbal barrage, Evelyn had remained perfectly still, her hands folded, her expression neutral, her breathing steady and controlled. She hadn't tried to defend herself, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even stood up from the bench. Her silence seemed to infuriate the recruits even more, as if her refusal to engage with their accusations was somehow proof of her guilt. Thompson, seeing her continued calm as a sign of weakness rather than strength, decided it was time to press their advantage. "All right, that's enough playing games. We're going to look through that bag, and when we find whatever stolen military property you've got in there, we're marching you straight to the MPs. You picked the wrong base to try your little scam. On!" He reached toward her duffel bag with them, confidence of someone who believed he was moments away from exposing a major security breach, completely unaware that he was about to trigger a chain of events that would teach him more about respect, humility, and the true meaning of military service than 6 months of basic training ever could. As Thompson's hand moved toward her duffel bag, something remarkable happened that would later be dissected and discussed by every witness present. Evelyn Cross didn't flinch, didn't pull the bag away, didn't raise her voice in protest. Instead, she did something that stopped Thompson's reach mid-motion and sent an almost electrical silence through the growing crowd of onlookers. She simply looked at him. It wasn't an angry look, or a pleading one, or even a particularly intense stare. It was the kind of look that a seasoned commander gives to a subordinate who is about to make a career-ending mistake. Patient, almost parental, but carrying within it depths of experience and authority that hit Thompson like a physical force. For the first time since this confrontation began, he hesitated. Evelyn's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Yet somehow it cut through the ambient noise of the busy military courtyard with crystalline clarity. "Before you touch that bag, young man, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing and why you believe you have the authority to do it." Her words carried no threat, no anger, no desperation. They were delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Someone who understood that true authority never needed to raise its voice to be heard. The effect on the 4 recruits was immediate and unsettling. Jackson, who had been the most vocal in his accusations, found himself taking an unconscious step backward. There was something about the way she spoke, not the words themselves, but the underlying current of absolute confidence that made his carefully rehearsed arguments suddenly feel hollow and ridiculous. He opened his mouth to continue his verbal assault, but no words came. Rivera, who prided himself on reading people and situations, felt a growing unease that he couldn't quite identify. The woman's stillness wasn't the nervous immobility of someone caught in a lie. It was the centered calm of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents than 4 angry recruits and emerged victorious. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. But there was something in the air around her that made Rivera's survival instincts start whispering warnings he didn't want to hear. Walsh, the youngest and most impressionable of the group, was the first to notice that their audience was beginning to shift. What had started as curious onlookers gathering to watch a potential confrontation was evolving into something else entirely. Several of the watching personnel, particularly the older, enlisted men and the few officers who had paused to observe, were beginning to show signs of recognition, confusion, and what looked suspiciously like concern. But it was Thompson who bore the full weight of Evelyn's attention, and he was beginning to understand that he had somehow stepped into waters far deeper than he had anticipated. The confidence that had carried him through the initial confrontation was evaporating like morning mist, replaced by a growing sense that he was missing something crucial, something that everyone else seemed to be picking up on, but that remained just beyond his comprehension. Evelyn's silence stretched on. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone searching for words, but the purposeful pause of someone who had learned that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. She continued to watch Thompson with that same patient expression, waiting to see if he would have the wisdom to step back from the precipice he was approaching, or if he would need to learn his lesson the hard way. The psychological effect of her restraint was devastating to the recruits' momentum. They had prepared for anger, for denial, for panic, all the responses they expected from someone caught in a deception. They had not prepared for this unshakable calm, this quiet dignity that seemed to transform their righteous anger into something that felt increasingly petty and small. Thompson's hand, which had been reaching for her bag with such confidence moments before, now hung suspended in the air between them. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, could sense the shifting mood of the crowd, but most unnervingly, he could feel the steady gaze of this woman who refused to be intimidated by their accusations or impressed by their supposed authority. Thompson began, then stopped. For the first time in this entire encounter, he found himself genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. The script he had been following in his head, confront the fraud, expose the deception, receive praise for his vigilance, no longer seemed to apply to the situation he found himself in. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. A gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, but it conveyed a wealth of meaning. It was the look of someone who had mentored thousands of young soldiers, who had seen every type of military personality, who could read the character of a recruit with the same ease that others read newspaper headlines. And what she was reading in Thompson's face wasn't malice or genuine belief in wrongdoing. It was the dangerous combination of youth, inexperience, and the desperate need to prove himself that had led countless promising young soldiers astray. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the unusual nature of the confrontation. Military personnel were accustomed to seeing disciplinary actions, training exercises, and even the occasional dispute between service members. But there was something different about this scene, something in the woman's bearing, in the growing uncertainty of the recruits, in the way senior personnel in the crowd were beginning to exchange meaningful glances and quiet conversations. Staff Sergeant Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had been walking past on his way to the commissary, stopped and studied the scene with the trained eye of someone who had witnessed countless military situations. Something about the woman on the bench struck him as familiar, though he couldn't quite place where he might have seen her before. Her composure under pressure, the way she carried herself even while sitting, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her despite her civilian clothes, it all triggered memories. He couldn't quite access Master Chief Peterson, who had been observing from near the base exchange, felt his own recognition stirring. There was something about the woman's profile, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head, that reminded him of someone he had served with years ago. Though the details remained frustratingly out of reach, Evelyn seemed aware of the growing attention. But her focus remained entirely on the 4 young men who had challenged her. Her expression suggested that she was giving them one final opportunity to reconsider their actions, to step back from a course that would soon be beyond their control. Her silence was both a gift and a warning, a chance for them to save face before forces much larger than this small confrontation came into play. Thompson felt the weight of that silence pressing down on him. And for the first time since this began, he wondered if he might have made a terrible mistake. The moment Thompson's trembling fingers made contact with the worn canvas of Evelyn's duffel bag, the atmosphere in the courtyard shifted like the air pressure before a storm. What had been a tense confrontation suddenly became something else entirely, unveiling that would change everything. The 4 recruits thought they understood about the woman sitting before them. The zipper moved with surprising ease, as if the bag had been opened and closed countless times over many years. As Thompson pulled back the canvas flap, expecting to find cheap military surplus items or obviously fake credentials, his hands instead encountered something that made him pause. The first item his fingers touched was smooth, cold metal wrapped carefully in what felt like silk cloth. "What is it?" Jackson whispered, his earlier bravado beginning to crack as he noticed the almost reverent way Thompson was handling whatever lay within the bag. Thompson's hands moved slowly, instinctively treating the wrapped object with a care that contradicted his aggressive intentions from moments before. As he unwrapped the silk cloth, the afternoon sunlight caught the surface of what appeared to be a military medal, but not just any medal. The distinctive star-shaped design, the deep blue ribbon, the weight of the medal itself, even Thompson's limited experience, was enough to recognize that this was something extraordinary. Rivera leaned closer, his eyes widening as more details became visible. Is that real?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. The medal bore engravings that spoke of the highest levels of military service, the kind of recognition that was reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism and sacrifice. But the metal was just the beginning. As Thompson continued to carefully remove items from the bag, each discovery seemed to contradict their assumptions more completely than the last. There was a folded flag, not the cheap replica flags sold in gift shops, but the heavy, precisely folded triangle of cloth that is presented to the families of fallen heroes. The creases were sharp, the fabric pristine, and it was wrapped with the kind of care that suggested it held immense personal significance. Walsh reached out tentatively toward what appeared to be a framed photograph, then pulled his hand back as if afraid to touch it. The image showed a younger version of the woman sitting before them, but she was wearing a naval uniform with insignia that made Walsh's heart skip a beat. Even with his limited knowledge of military ranks, he could see that the uniform in the photograph belonged to someone of significant authority. Jackson's hands were shaking now as he helped Thompson reveal more contents. There were commendation letters on official letterhead, their formal language speaking of extraordinary leadership under fire and tactical brilliance that saved countless lives. There were photographs of the woman, shaking hands with men in uniforms bearing stars on their shoulders, standing on the bridges of massive naval vessels, addressing formations of hundreds of sailors. The crowd that had gathered to watch what they expected to be the exposure of a fraud was now witnessing something entirely different. The whispered conversations among the onlookers began to take on a different tone. Master Chief Peterson stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the photographs that were being revealed. Something about the naval vessel in one of the images sparked a memory, a recollection of a story he had heard years ago, about a commander who had achieved the impossible during a crisis in the Pacific. Staff Sergeant Martinez felt his own recognition crystallizing as he studied the woman's face in the photographs and compared it to the quiet figure on the bench. The years had added lines and gray hair, but the eyes were unmistakable, the same steady gaze that was now watching four young recruits discover exactly who they had been attempting to humiliate. Thompson's movements became increasingly careful as he continued to unpack what was clearly a collection of deeply personal military memorabilia. There were navigation charts marked with handwritten notes, their margins filled with tactical annotations in a precise script. There were letters of commendation from foreign naval commanders, written in multiple languages but all expressing the same theme of gratitude and respect. There was a ship's compass, its brass surface polished to a mirror shine, engraved with coordinates that Thompson suspected marked the location of some significant naval engagement. Rivera found himself staring at a particular photograph that showed their target, standing on what appeared to be the bridge of a destroyer, surrounded by other officers, with the backdrop of a massive naval operation visible through the windows behind them. The scale of the operation suggested something far beyond the routine exercises or peacekeeping missions that filled most military careers. This was clearly documentation of someone who had been at the center of events that shaped naval history. The silence that had settled over the immediate area was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of normal base activity, the rumble of vehicles, the calls of drill instructors, the mechanical hum of air conditioning units. But within the bubble of attention that surrounded the bench, the only sound was the careful rustling of silk and paper as more evidence emerged from the bag. Jackson tried to speak several times, opening his mouth and then closing it again as each new revelation made their initial assumptions more obviously wrong. The woman they had accused of stolen valor was clearly someone whose actual valor was documented in ways that went far beyond anything they had imagined possible. Walsh felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as the magnitude of their mistake became undeniable. These weren't the cheap props of someone playing dress-up. These were the carefully preserved memories of someone whose service had clearly been extraordinary. The weight of the objects, the official seals, the photographic evidence of interactions with the highest levels of military leadership It all painted a picture of someone whose credentials were not only legitimate, but remarkable. Thompson's hands were now visibly shaking as he realized that every item he touched represented achievements that dwarfed anything he might accomplish in his entire military career. The medals alone told a story of courage under fire, of leadership in impossible situations, of service that had literally saved lives and shaped the course of military operations. The 4 recruits found themselves frozen in place, surrounded by the evidence of their catastrophic error in judgment, while the woman who owned these treasures continued to sit quietly, watching them with the same patient expression she had maintained throughout their entire confrontation. The discovery phase was complete, and what they had found would change everything that happened next. The final item that Thompson's trembling hands extracted from the duffel bag was what shattered the last vestiges of the recruit's confidence and sent shock waves through the growing crowd of witnesses. Wrapped in a protective cloth case was a brass nameplate, its surface polished to mirror brightness despite obvious age. As Thompson unwrapped it with hands that could barely maintain their grip, the engraved letters seemed to leap from the metal surface with devastating clarity. Admiral E. Cross, Pacific Fleet Command. The nameplate hit Thompson like a physical blow. He stared at the brass rectangle, then looked up at the woman on the bench, his mind struggling to process the connection between the quiet figure in civilian clothes and the title that represented one of the highest positions in the United States Navy. Admiral. Not just any officer, but an admiral, a rank so elevated that Thompson had never actually met anyone who held it. Rivera's face had gone completely white as the implications crashed over him. "Admiral?" he whispered, the word catching in his throat. He looked around desperately at the crowd, hoping someone would tell him this was all an elaborate joke, that the nameplate was a fake, that somehow their original assumptions were still correct. Instead, he saw faces filled with recognition, respect, and in some cases, what looked suspiciously like awe. Jackson felt his knees begin to buckle as the full weight of their mistake became undeniable. An admiral. They had accused an admiral of stolen valor. They had demanded to search her belongings. They had treated someone who outranked virtually everyone on the entire base like a common criminal. The magnitude of their error was so overwhelming that Jackson found himself unable to form coherent thoughts, let alone words. Walsh, the youngest of the group, was the first to break completely. Tears began streaming down his face as he realized that everything they had been taught about respect, military bearing, and the chain of command had been not just ignored, but catastrophically violated. They had humiliated themselves in front of what appeared to be half the base, but more importantly, they had shown profound disrespect to someone whose service record clearly represented the pinnacle of naval achievement. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Master Chief Peterson stepped forward, his 20 years of naval experience allowing him to recognize not just the rank, but the specific nameplate. "Sweet Mother of God," he breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of reverence and disbelief. "Admiral Cross. Admiral Evelyn Cross." The way he spoke the name suggested it carried significance far beyond just the rank itself. Staff. Sergeant Martinez felt his own memory finally click into place. He had heard stories about Admiral Cross during his deployment in the Pacific, stories that had taken on almost legendary status among the enlisted personnel. She was the commander who had saved an entire carrier group during what the media had called the incident, though the full details remained classified. She was the strategist whose tactical innovations had become required study at the Naval War College. She was the leader whose name was spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for historical figures. The murmur that ran through the crowd was unlike anything the 4 recruits had ever heard. Not the excited chatter of people witnessing drama, but the hushed tones of people in the presence of genuine greatness. Personnel who had been casually observing from a distance now approached with obvious respect. their postures straightening, their expressions serious. Thompson tried to hand the nameplate back to Evelyn, but his hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the precious item. She reached out calmly and took it from him, her movements steady and controlled, showing none of the anger or vindictiveness that would have been justified given their treatment of her. Admiral, we didn't know," Thompson stammered, his voice breaking with emotion. The words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. How could they not have known? How could they have been so blind, so arrogant, so completely wrong in their assessment? Rivera found himself backing away from the bench, his face burning with shame so intense it felt like physical pain. They had accused this woman of dishonoring the uniform while she had actually served with such distinction that her name was known throughout the Navy. They had questioned her right to be on the base while she had probably commanded operations that protected the very freedom they enjoyed. Jackson's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a humiliation so profound that he wished he could simply disappear. He thought about every word they had said, every accusation they had made, every moment of righteous indignation they had displayed, and he felt sick to his stomach. They had not only been wrong, they had been spectacularly, embarrassingly, career-threateningly wrong. The silence that followed Thompson's broken apology stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Admiral Cross carefully rewrapped the nameplate and placed it back in her bag, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of command experience and the wisdom that comes from facing far more serious challenges than 4 misguided young recruits. "The fact that you didn't know," she said quietly, "is exactly the problem." Her words hit the 4 young men like hammer blows. She wasn't angry, wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding their punishment or dismissal from the service. Instead, she was offering them something far more devastating, a moment of clarity about their own ignorance and presumption. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the immediate area that Admiral Cross was present on the base. Officers who had been in meetings abandoned their schedules to catch a glimpse of someone whose reputation preceded her into every room she entered. Enlisted personnel stood at respectful distances, many of them recognizing her from photographs in their training materials or from stories passed down through the ranks. Thompson looked around desperately, hoping to find some way to undo what had been done. Some words that could take back their accusations and restore the dignity they had tried to strip from someone who had earned respect in ways they could barely comprehend. But there was no undoing what had happened, no taking back the humiliation they had inflicted not on her, but ultimately on themselves. The 4 recruits stood frozen in the aftermath of their discovery, surrounded by evidence of their catastrophic error in judgment, while Admiral Cross prepared to teach them a lesson about respect, assumption, and the true meaning of military service that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tense atmosphere like the measured beat of a military drum. Heavy, purposeful strides that carried the unmistakable rhythm of senior leadership moved across the concrete courtyard, drawing the attention of everyone in the gathered crowd. The 4 recruits, still reeling from the shock of their discovery, turned to see a figure that made their hearts sink even further into the pit of despair that had become their afternoon. Captain Daniel Hayes emerged from the administrative building, his uniform crisp despite the afternoon heat, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command and decisive action. At 45, Hayes had spent over 2 decades in the Navy, rising through the ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to the principles of military service. His presence on any base commanded immediate attention, and today was no exception. But there was something different about Captain Hayes as he approached the scene. His usual stern expression had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern, and there was an urgency in his stride that suggested this was not a routine inspection or casual observation. Word had reached him in his office that there was a situation developing in the courtyard involving what appeared to be a confrontation between recruits and a civilian, a situation that had somehow escalated to the point where base security was considering intervention. What Captain Hayes had not expected as he drew closer to the crowd was to recognize the figure at the center of the commotion. When his eyes fell upon Admiral Cross, sitting quietly on the bench with her belongings scattered around her by the 4 mortified recruits, his stride faltered for just a moment. Then his pace quickened dramatically. "What in the hell is going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the immediate vicinity snap to attention. The crowd parted automatically to allow him passage, and the 4 recruits felt their last hopes for a quiet resolution to their mistake evaporate entirely. Thompson, still clutching one of the Admiral's commendation letters, tried to speak but found that no words would come. The presence of a captain, someone whose rank represented everything they had been taught to respect and fear, combined with their growing understanding of exactly who they had been harassing, had rendered him effectively mute. Captain Hayes surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing complex situations quickly. He saw the Admiral's belongings spread across the bench, the obvious distress of the 4 recruits, the mixture of concern and anticipation on the faces of the gathered crowd. But most importantly, he saw Admiral Cross herself, sitting with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Admiral," Captain Hayes said, his voice immediately shifting from the harsh command tone he had used moments before to one of profound respect. He snapped to attention with a precision that made the watching personnel straighten their own postures instinctively. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were on base today." The use of her proper title sent another shockwave through the 4 recruits, who had somehow hoped that the nameplate might have been a mistake, that the photographs could have been explained away, that there might still be some way for their original assumptions to be correct. Hearing a captain address her as Admiral removed any remaining doubt about her identity and rank. Captain Hayes's attention then turned to the 4 recruits, and his expression hardened into something that made them wish they could simply dissolve into the concrete beneath their feet. Would someone care to explain why Admiral Cross's personal belongings are scattered across this bench, and why these 4 recruits appear to be in the process of conducting an unauthorized search? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over their heads. Rivera tried to form an explanation, but every possible response seemed to make their situation worse. How could they explain that they had accused an admiral of stolen valor? How could they justify their assumption that someone of her obvious distinction was attempting to defraud the military? How could they possibly make Captain Hayes understand the mindset that had led them to this catastrophic error in judgment? Jackson finally managed to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, we thought, we believed she was..." But the words died in his throat as he realized there was no way to explain their actions that wouldn't make them sound like complete fools. Admiral Cross, who had been watching this exchange with the same patient attention she had shown throughout the entire incident, finally spoke. "Captain Hayes, these young men believed they were protecting the integrity of your base. They saw someone they assumed was attempting to commit fraud, and they took action based on their understanding of their duties." Her words, spoken without anger or vindictiveness, somehow made the situation even more painful for the 4 recruits. She was defending them, explaining their actions in the most charitable possible terms, even after the way they had treated her. The grace she was showing in the face of their profound disrespect was perhaps more devastating than any punishment could have been. Captain Hayes studied Admiral Cross for a long moment, his expression suggesting that he was seeing depths of character that went far beyond her impressive military record. "Admiral, with all due respect, these recruits had no authority to conduct any kind of search or investigation. Their actions, regardless of their intentions, represent a serious breach of protocol and basic military courtesy. The captain's attention returned to Thompson, who was still holding the commendation letter with hands that had not stopped shaking since the discovery of Admiral Cross's true identity. "Recruit Thompson, is it?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that was more frightening than any shouting could have been. "Yes, sir," Thompson managed to reply, his voice cracking with the strain of the moment. "Would you care to explain to me exactly what gave you the authority to detain and search Admiral Cross?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through any possible excuse or justification the recruits might have attempted to offer. The four young men stood in a tableau of complete defeat, surrounded by the evidence of their mistake, facing a captain whose displeasure was evident in every line of his posture, while the admiral they had wronged continued to show them a mercy they had not earned and did not deserve. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left for them to hide. Captain Hayes's demand for an explanation hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. But before any of the recruits could attempt to answer, Admiral Cross raised her hand in a gesture that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. The simple movement carried such natural authority that even Captain Hayes paused, recognizing that she was about to take control of the situation. "Captain, before these young men attempt to explain themselves, perhaps I should provide some context about who I am and why their confusion is understandable," Admiral Cross said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent decades briefing senior leadership on complex military situations. She gestured toward the bench where her belongings remained scattered, each item a testament to a career that had spanned some of the most challenging periods in recent naval history. "My name is Admiral Evelyn Cross, and I commanded the Pacific Fleet's 7th Task Force from 2018 to 2023. During that time, my operations included the humanitarian rescue mission following the tsunami of 2019, the strategic defense of shipping lanes during the Gulf crisis, and the coordination of multinational naval exercises that prevented what intelligence analysts believed could have escalated into a regional conflict." The gathered crowd had grown silent as Admiral Cross began to speak, her words painting a picture of service that went far beyond what most military personnel would ever experience. Master Chief Peterson found himself nodding as memories of news reports and classified briefings began to align with the woman standing before them. The tsunami rescue mission alone had saved over 3,000 civilians from devastated coastal areas, an operation that had required split-second decision-making and flawless coordination between multiple naval vessels. The 7th Task Force, Admiral Cross continued, consisted of 2 carrier groups, 8 destroyers, 4 submarines, and support vessels carrying a combined crew of over 15,000 personnel. During the Gulf crisis, we maintained continuous operations for 8 months, during which time not a single vessel under my command suffered casualties, despite operating in what were considered extremely hostile waters. Thompson felt his legs growing weak as the magnitude of Admiral Cross's accomplishments became clear. 15,000 personnel, multiple carrier groups, operations that had prevented international conflicts. He tried to reconcile this information with the quiet woman in civilian clothes they had accused of fraud, and the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Rivera found himself remembering fragments of news coverage from the Gulf crisis, stories about a naval commander whose tactical innovations had prevented what military analysts called the most dangerous naval standoff since World War II. The media had focused on the diplomatic aspects of the resolution, but the military personnel involved had known that it was superior naval strategy that had made peaceful resolution possible. "During my final deployment," Admiral Cross continued, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "We encountered a situation that required me to make a decision that saved the lives of 800 sailors aboard the USS Constellation, which had suffered catastrophic damage during a training exercise that went wrong. The rescue operation required navigating through a Category 4 hurricane with zero visibility, coordinating with Coast Guard and civilian vessels, and making real-time tactical decisions that had to be perfect the first time." Captain Hayes had heard briefings about the Constellation incident, though many of the details remained classified. What was known publicly was that an admiral had risked her entire task force to save a single damaged vessel, and that the operation had succeeded against odds that most naval strategists had considered impossible. What wasn't generally known was the personal cost that such decisions carried for the commanders who made them. Jackson stared at Admiral Cross with growing horror as he realized that they had not only misjudged her current status, but had completely failed to comprehend the level of responsibility she had carried and the lives that had depended on her decisions. 800 sailors, 15,000 personnel under her command. International crises prevented through her strategic thinking. The scope of her service made their 6 weeks of basic training seem laughably insignificant. "Following the Constellation rescue," Admiral Cross said, her voice becoming quieter but somehow carrying more weight, "I was offered promotion to Fleet Admiral and assignment to the Pentagon Strategic Planning Division. It was an honor that represented the pinnacle of naval career advancement, the kind of position that shapes military policy for decades to come." Walsh felt tears forming in his eyes as he began to understand that they were hearing not just a recitation of military accomplishments, but the personal story of someone who had sacrificed more for their country than he had ever imagined possible. The promotion she mentioned would have placed her among the most powerful military leaders in the nation, someone whose decisions could affect global security. "I declined the promotion," Admiral Cross said simply, her words hitting the gathered crowd like a thunderclap. "After 30 years of service, after operations that had taken me away from my family for months at a time, after making decisions that affected thousands of lives, I chose to retire. Not because I was tired of serving, but because I realized there were different ways to serve, and different kinds of sacrifices worth making." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. The idea that someone would turn down such a prestigious appointment, would walk away from the highest levels of military power and influence, challenged everything the recruits thought they understood about military ambition and career success. Captain Hayes found himself looking at Admiral Cross with new appreciation. He had known about her military record, had read the classified reports about her operations, but hearing her speak about the personal decisions that had shaped her career provided insights that no briefing document could convey. The woman sitting before them had not just served with distinction. She had redefined what distinguished service meant. The 4 recruits stood in stunned silence, finally beginning to comprehend not just who they had confronted, but the depth of their failure to recognize true military greatness. When it sat quietly before them, the weight of Admiral Cross's revelation settled over the courtyard like a heavy blanket, transforming what had begun as a confrontation into something approaching a sacred moment of recognition. Captain Hayes stood frozen for several heartbeats, processing not just the words she had spoken, but the profound implications of what had just occurred under his command. When he finally moved, it was with the deliberate precision of someone performing a ritual that had deep personal meaning. Slowly, Captain Hayes brought his right hand to his forehead in the most precise military salute of his career. His spine straightened to absolute attention. His heels came together with an audible click, and his entire bearing transformed into a display of respect so profound that it seemed to elevate the very air around him. "Admiral Cross," he said, his voice thick with emotion and reverence, "it is an honor beyond measure to have you on this base. The effect of Captain Hayes's salute rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Master Chief Peterson immediately followed suit, his own salute crisp and unwavering. His weathered face showing a mixture of pride and humility at being in the presence of someone whose reputation had shaped his understanding of naval excellence. "Admiral," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of 20 years of faithful service. Staff Sergeant Martinez stepped forward and added his own salute, followed by every other military member present. Within moments, the courtyard had transformed into an impromptu ceremony of recognition, with dozens of service members paying their respects to someone whose contributions to their shared profession had earned legendary status. The sound of boots clicking to attention created a rhythmic percussion that seemed to honor not just Admiral Cross herself, but everything she represented about dedication, sacrifice, and military excellence. But it was the 4 recruits who found themselves facing the most profound moment of their young military careers. Thompson, who had led the charge against what he believed was a fraud, now stood face to face with someone whose service record represented everything he hoped to achieve in his own career, magnified beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. The salute he attempted was shaky and imperfect, his hand trembling as he brought it to his forehead. His eyes filled with tears of shame and newfound understanding. Rivera's salute was steadier, but no less emotional. As his hand rose to the proper position, he found himself thinking about every assumption he had made, every judgment he had rendered based on appearance rather than substance. The woman before him had commanded fleets while he had been in high school, had made life and death decisions while he had been worrying about homework and social media, had served their country with distinction while he had been taking freedom for granted. Jackson's face was streaked with tears as he attempted his salute, his body shaking with the magnitude of his emotional response to the situation. Every word of accusation he had spoken echoed in his memory, each moment of righteous indignation now transformed into a source of profound regret. He had questioned the honor of someone whose honor was literally legendary, had challenged the integrity of someone whose integrity had saved thousands of lives. Walsh, the youngest of the group, could barely maintain his composure as he raised his trembling hand in salute. The weight of Admiral Cross's service record, combined with the grace she had shown in the face of their disrespect, had shattered his understanding of what it meant to be a true military leader. She had not sought revenge, had not demanded their punishment, had not even raised her voice in anger despite having every right to do so. Admiral Cross received the salutes with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. She acknowledged each one with a slight nod, her expression showing neither pride nor false modesty, but simply the acceptance of someone who had long ago learned that respect must be earned through actions rather than demanded through rank. When the last salute had been offered and acknowledged, she gestured for everyone to relax their positions. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying gratitude that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. "But I want you all to understand something important. The salutes you're offering me are not just for my service, but for what that service represents. Every one of you who wears this uniform, or aspires to wear it with honor, carries the same responsibility I carried, the same opportunity to serve something larger than yourself." Captain Hayes found himself nodding as Admiral Cross spoke, recognizing in her words the kind of leadership wisdom that could only come from decades of actual command experience. She was taking what could have been a moment of personal triumph and transforming it into a teaching opportunity for everyone present. "These 4 young men," Admiral Cross continued, gesturing toward the recruits who had confronted her, "made assumptions based on limited information and acted according to their understanding of their duty. Their mistake was not in wanting to protect military integrity, but in believing that they could judge that integrity based on appearance alone." Thompson felt a mixture of gratitude and continued shame wash over him. Even now, after revealing the full scope of her accomplishments, Admiral Cross was finding ways to frame their actions in terms that preserved their dignity while teaching them essential lessons about military service. The crowd around them had grown even larger as word continued to spread throughout the base that Admiral Cross was present. Officers who had been attending meetings abandoned their schedules. Enlisted personnel found excuses to pass through the area. And even civilian base employees gathered at respectful distances to witness what many recognized as a historic moment. Rivera looked around at the assembled crowd and realized that they were all learning the same lesson he was learning, that true military greatness often walks quietly among us, that the most important service is often performed far from public recognition, and that respect must be offered based on character and achievement rather than rank or appearance. The moment stretched on, heavy with meaning and transformation. As 4 young recruits began to understand what it truly meant to serve with honor. As the formal salutes concluded, and the immediate tension began to ease, Admiral Cross carefully began returning her belongings to the weathered duffel bag that had started this entire encounter. Each item was placed with the same methodical care she had shown throughout the confrontation, the medals wrapped in their silk cloth, the photographs arranged to prevent damage, the official documents folded precisely along their original creases. The 4 recruits watched in fascination as she handled these artifacts of an extraordinary career with the casual familiarity of someone who had lived every moment they represented. Captain Hayes, still processing the magnitude of what had transpired under his command, cleared his throat respectfully. "Admiral Cross, if I may ask, what brings you to Fort Meridian today? I wasn't informed of any official visit or ceremony requiring your presence." Admiral Cross paused in her packing, her hands resting on what appeared to be a small, wrapped bundle that she had not yet returned to the bag. When she looked up at Captain Hayes, there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been present during the confrontation with the recruits, not weakness, but a kind of vulnerability that spoke to the personal nature of her mission. "I'm not here in any official capacity, Captain," she replied, her voice taking on a more intimate tone that seemed to draw the gathered crowd closer. "Today marks the 5th anniversary of the death of Rear Admiral James Mitchell, who served as my mentor and friend for over 15 years. Before his passing, Admiral Mitchell specifically requested that his personal effects be donated to the Fort Meridian Memorial Library, where they could serve as educational resources for future generations of naval officers." Thompson felt his stomach drop as the true purpose of Admiral Cross's visit became clear. She hadn't been attempting to commit fraud or claim benefits she wasn't entitled to. She had been quietly, humbly carrying out the final wishes of a fallen comrade, honoring the memory of someone who had clearly meant a great deal to her. The paperwork they had seen her completing wasn't an attempt at deception, it was the documentation required for a significant memorial donation. Rivera found himself staring at the wrapped bundle in Admiral Cross's hands, realizing that it likely contained items of profound personal and historical significance. Admiral Mitchell's name was familiar to him from his military history classes, though he was only beginning to appreciate the connections between the legendary figures he had studied and the living woman before him who had actually served alongside them. Admiral Mitchell was instrumental in developing the tactical doctrines that guided my command decisions during the Gulf crisis. Admiral Cross continued, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a compass and a set of navigation instruments that were clearly decades old but meticulously maintained. These belonged to him during his service in the South Pacific, and he used them to navigate through some of the most challenging operations in modern naval history. Jackson realized with growing horror that they had interrupted what was essentially a sacred ritual, the transfer of a fallen officer's legacy to a place where it could inspire and educate future generations. Admiral Cross had been quietly honoring her mentor's memory, carrying out his final wishes with the same dedication she had shown throughout her career. And they had treated her like a common criminal. Walsh watched as Admiral Cross handled the navigation instruments with obvious reverence, her fingers tracing the brass surfaces with the familiarity of someone who had used similar tools during her own service. The compass, in particular, seemed to hold special significance for her, and Walsh found himself wondering what navigational challenges she had faced during her years of command. What life-and-death decisions had been made using instruments just like these? The Memorial Library houses one of the most comprehensive collections of naval history and tactical studies on the West Coast, Admiral Cross explained, carefully rewrapping the instruments. Admiral Mitchell believed that future officers could learn more from studying the actual tools and documents of past operations than from any textbook or simulation. He wanted these pieces to be available for hands-on study, not locked away in some display case. Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully, his appreciation for both Admiral Cross and Admiral Mitchell's vision growing with each detail. The donation will be invaluable, Admiral. Our officer candidates frequently struggle with traditional navigation techniques, assuming they can rely entirely on digital systems. Having access to the actual instruments used by experienced commanders will provide them with perspectives they can't get anywhere else. The mention of officer candidates seemed to remind Admiral Cross of the 4 young men who had confronted her, and she turned her attention back to them with an expression that was both serious and compassionate. This brings me to why today's encounter has been particularly meaningful. Beyond the obvious lessons about making assumptions, Thompson felt his pulse quicken as Admiral Cross's attention focused on their group. Throughout this entire ordeal, she had shown them more grace and understanding than they deserved. But he sensed that she was about to offer them something even more valuable: insight that could shape the rest of their military careers. "You 4 represent the future of military service," Admiral Cross said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had mentored countless young officers over the years. "Your instinct to protect military integrity was correct, even if your methods were flawed. The question now is what you'll do with this experience, how you'll allow it to shape your understanding of what it means to serve with honor." Rivera felt tears forming in his eyes, again as he recognized that Admiral Cross was offering them redemption rather than condemnation, a chance to learn and grow rather than simply punishment for their mistakes. Her approach to leadership was unlike anything they had encountered in their brief military experience, firm but compassionate, authoritative but understanding. Admiral Mitchell often told me that the mark of true leadership wasn't avoiding mistakes, but learning from them and ensuring they led to better decisions in the future, Admiral Cross continued, her words carrying the weight of decades of experience and the wisdom of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than a group of overeager recruits. The 4 young men stood transfixed, understanding that they were receiving a master class in military leadership from someone whose qualifications were beyond question, and that the lessons they learned today would influence every decision they made for the rest of their careers. The afternoon sun had begun to cast longer shadows across the courtyard as Admiral Cross prepared to conclude her unexpected lesson in military leadership and human dignity. The crowd that had gathered to witness what they initially thought would be a simple disciplinary action had instead become part of something far more profound, a moment that would be retold in barracks and officer clubs for years to come, becoming part of the folklore that shapes military culture and values. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his expression showing the deep respect that comes from witnessing true leadership in action. "Admiral Cross, please allow me to personally escort you to the Memorial Library. It would be an honor to ensure that Admiral Mitchell's donation receives the recognition and ceremony it deserves." Admiral Cross smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. A genuine expression of warmth that transformed her face and reminded everyone present that beneath the legendary service record was a human being who appreciated simple gestures of respect and courtesy. "Thank you, Captain. That would be very meaningful." Admiral Mitchell would have appreciated the ceremony. He always believed that military traditions served important purposes beyond mere formality. As Admiral Cross shouldered her duffel bag and prepared to leave, she turned one final time to address the 4 recruits who had unwittingly triggered this extraordinary encounter. Her words would become the most important guidance any of them would receive during their military careers, spoken by someone whose authority to offer such guidance was beyond dispute. "Thompson, Rivera, Jackson, Walsh," she said, addressing each of them by name with the precision of someone accustomed to remembering the details that matter. "I want you to carry 3 lessons with you from today. First, true military bearing isn't about the uniform you wear or the rank on your collar. It's about the character you demonstrate when you think no one important is watching." Thompson nodded solemnly, his face still showing the emotional impact of the day's events. He would remember Admiral Cross's words for the rest of his life, using them as a guide for every decision he made as he progressed through his military career. The lesson about character would influence how he treated subordinates, how he approached challenges, and how he understood the true meaning of military service. Second, Admiral Cross continued, respect must be earned through actions, not demanded through authority. The moment you believe your rank entitles you to treat others poorly is the moment you stop being worthy of that rank. True leaders elevate others, they don't diminish them. Rivera felt these words resonate deeply within him, understanding that Admiral Cross was offering him insight into the kind of leader he wanted to become. Her example throughout their confrontation had demonstrated exactly what she was describing. She had maintained her dignity without diminishing theirs, had asserted her authority without destroying their self-respect. "Finally," Admiral Cross said, her voice taking on the weight of someone who had learned this lesson through decades of command experience, "never assume that courage, sacrifice, and dedication will always be obvious or visible. Some of the greatest heroes I've served with were people you would pass on the street without a second glance. Some of the most important battles are fought quietly, by people who never seek recognition for their service." Jackson found himself thinking about all the assumptions he had made, not just about Admiral Cross, but about countless other people throughout his life. Her words challenged him to reconsider how he evaluated others, how he determined who deserved respect, and how he understood the many different forms that service and sacrifice could take. Walsh, wiping tears from his eyes, managed to find his voice. "Admiral, how do we make sure we never make this kind of mistake again? How do we learn to see people the way we should?" Admiral Cross paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you judge. You ask questions instead of making assumptions. And most importantly, you remember that every person you meet carries stories, experiences, and sacrifices that you know nothing about." The wisdom in her words settled over the gathered crowd like a benediction, offering guidance that extended far beyond military service into every aspect of human interaction. Master Chief Peterson found himself nodding, recognizing truths he had learned through his own years of service, but had never heard articulated so clearly. Staff Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his voice respectful but curious. "Admiral, will you be visiting the base again? Many of our junior officers would benefit enormously from hearing your perspectives on leadership and service." Admiral Cross considered the question thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she said with a slight smile. "But remember that the best leadership lessons aren't taught in formal settings. They're demonstrated in moments like this one, when people think their actions don't matter because no one important is watching." Today, these 4 young men learned that someone is always watching. and that how we treat others, especially those we believe can't help or harm us, reveals who we truly are. As Admiral Cross and Captain Hayes began walking toward the Memorial Library, followed by a respectful procession of base personnel, the 4 recruits remained where they stood, processing the magnitude of their experience and the lessons they would carry forward. The story of their encounter with Admiral Cross would spread throughout Fort Meridian within hours. But more importantly, it would become part of their personal legends, the day they learned that true greatness often walks quietly among us, that respect must be given before it can be earned, and that the most important lessons in military service often come from the moments when we think we're teaching others but discover we're the ones who need to learn. From that day forward, whenever new recruits arrived at Fort Meridian, they would hear the story of Admiral Cross and the 4 soldiers who learned the most important lesson of their careers from someone they initially failed to recognize. And the memorial plaque that would eventually be placed in the library honoring Admiral Mitchell's donation would include a simple inscription that Admiral Cross had requested. True service is measured not by the recognition it receives, but by the lives it touches and the future it shapes. The lesson was complete, and 4 young soldiers had been transformed into something they had never expected to become that day: wiser, humbler, and better prepared to serve with the honor their uniform demanded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.